darkness. Complete suffocating darkness that pressed against Annika's eyes like a physical weight. She couldn't see Tokala beside her, couldn't see her own hands, couldn't see anything except the occasional spark when rocks shifted in the rubble pile that had sealed them inside the collapsed mine tunnel. "Don't let go," she whispered in Swedish, then English, her voice barely audible over the sound of water rushing somewhere in the blackness. Water that was rising, she realized with mounting terror, creeping up from ankle-deep to her knees in the space of minutes. Tokala's fingers tightened around hers, warm and steady despite the cold water soaking through their clothes. "I don't intend to," he replied, and she heard something in his voice that went beyond tactical partnership, beyond the practical marriage they'd entered 4 weeks ago for mutual protection. Above them, timber supports groaned with the weight of tons of earth pressing down. The storm hammering the prairie overhead sent water cascading through cracks in the tunnel ceiling. And somewhere upstream, the weir they'd tried to sabotage was failing not gradually, but catastrophically. 400,000 gallons of reservoir water was about to be released, and if it found its way into this tunnel system, they would drown in absolute darkness. Behind them, deeper in the mine, Satan made a wet rattling sound that meant he was dying. The bullet wound in his side had bled too long, and there was nothing they could do for him in this blackness. "We should not have come," Tokala said so quietly, she almost didn't hear it. "I should not have brought you into this. You didn't bring me." Annika corrected, her voice stronger than she felt. "I chose to come. I chose you. I choose this." His forehead pressed against hers in the darkness, their breaths mingling. She could feel his pulse hammering against her palm, where their hands still gripped each other. "Then we live or die together," he said. "Together," she echoed. And as the water rose and the earth groaned and the darkness pressed in from all sides, Annika Bergstrom realized that the most terrifying and the most liberating truth was this: she had never meant anything more in her entire life. 4 weeks earlier. The dust hung thick over Red Oak that September afternoon in 1869, turning the air into a shimmering haze that made distant objects waver like mirages. The town squatted on the Nebraska prairie, where Thunder Creek once ran strong enough to turn a mill wheel, but now barely managed a trickle that wouldn't satisfy a thirsty dog. Heat radiated from the packed earth of Main Street, and the few people moving about did so slowly, conserving energy in the oppressive warmth. Annika Bergstrom walked beside her husband through that hostile silence, her worn leather suitcase gripped tight in both hands. Her blue cotton dress, carefully mended at the cuffs and collar, had been her Sunday best when she'd arrived from Minnesota 2 years ago to teach Red Oak's children. Now it was simply all she owned that was decent enough for town. Her blonde hair, braided and pinned beneath a simple bonnet, showed the practical severity of her Swedish upbringing. But her eyes held something harder now, something forged in the aftermath of threats and the loss of her teaching position. Tokala moved beside her with the fluid grace of a man who'd learned to walk silently through tall grass while hunting. His buckskin shirt, decorated with intricate beadwork in the Lakota style, marked him as unmistakably other in this settlement of European immigrants and American ranchers. Copper bands circled his upper arms, catching the afternoon light, and his long black hair hung loose past his shoulders in the way of warriors. His dark eyes swept the street with constant vigilance, missing nothing. Not the women who turned their backs on the boarding house porch, not the boy who made mocking sounds until his mother yanked him inside. Not the ranch hand whose hand drifted toward his pistol as they passed. On the boarding house porch, 3 women in severe gray dresses turned away, in perfect synchronization aprons, pulled up to hide their whispered remarks. The words didn't carry, but the contempt did, sharp and unmistakable as a slap. Near the Mercantile, a cowboy with the big D brand burned into his leather vest spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed uncomfortably close to Annika's skirt hem. He didn't quite meet Tokala's eyes, but the challenge was clear in the set of his shoulders and the way his hand rested on his gun. That mail-order schoolteacher went and married herself a savage. Someone muttered from the shade of the mercantile awning, voice pitched to Carrie. Reckon she sleeps in a teepee now, eating raw meat like an animal. Laughter followed cruel performative laughter meant to wound. Annika's spine straightened by pure reflex, her chin lifting in the way her Swedish grandmother had taught her. When they try to make you small, you stand tall. She'd learned in the past 4 weeks that showing fear only encouraged them, only gave them the satisfaction they craved. Tokala's hand moved fractionally closer to her elbow, not touching, because that would give the town's gossips even more ammunition, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin and the silent promise that she wasn't alone. They passed the town well, where a knot of men stood staring down into the stone-lined shaft with expressions that mixed desperation and anger in equal measure. One hauled on the rope with visible effort, his face reddening from exertion. When the wooden bucket finally cleared the rim, everyone could see the pathetic trickle of muddy water coating the bottom. Barely enough to wet a horse's tongue, certainly not enough for the families who depended on this well. "Blast it all to hell," the man swore, dropping the bucket with a clatter that echoed across the quiet street. "That's the 3rd well gone brackish this week. If this keeps up, we'll be drinking alkali water by October, and you know what that does to a man's guts. If that creek dies, Red Oak dies with it." Another man said, his voice loud enough to be clearly heard by everyone on the street. His eyes cut toward Tokala and Annika as they walked past the accusation, unspoken but perfectly clear. "And we all know what happens when Indians get territorial about water. They dam it up, hoard it, leave decent Christian folk to die of thirst." The implication hung in the air like gun smoke. For months now, rumors had circulated through Red Oak that the Lakota camps downstream were somehow responsible for the drought-building secret dams performing rituals to steal rain-hoarding water out of spite or revenge. Never mind that the Lakota had been using Thunder Creek for generations before the first white settlers arrived. Never mind that their camps were suffering from the same drought, their children just as thirsty, their horses just as desperate. Fear and prejudice needed no logic, only a convenient target. From the south end of town, where the land sloped down toward the nearly dry creek bed, cattle bawled with the desperate hollow sound of animals in prolonged suffering. The noise rolled across the prairie like a lament underscoring the town's slow death by thirst. Annika shifted her suitcase to her left hand, flexing cramped fingers. Without planning it, without even thinking about it, her right hand brushed against Tokala's. Their fingers didn't clasp. That would invite worse trouble. Would give the town's moral guardians an excuse to intervene. But for one heartbeat, their strides matched perfectly. 2 people moving as one unit through a world determined to keep them separate. On the boarding house porch, the severe woman in gray shook her head with theatrical disapproval and leaned close to whisper to her neighbor. But Annika noticed one woman who didn't turn away, Miranda O'Rourke, the Irish dressmaker who owned the establishment. Miranda's weathered face, lined from years of frontier hardship, remained carefully neutral, but her sharp green eyes followed them with something that wasn't contempt. Something closer to assessment, perhaps, even the beginning of grudging respect. "We're nearly there," Annika said quietly first, in Swedish, "Vus är nästan framme," then catching herself and repeating it in English. Her voice didn't waver. But Tokala heard the tightness in it, the strain of maintaining dignity under sustained assault. "I know," he replied, his English carrying the careful precision of someone who'd learned it from fur traders, army scouts, and a French-Canadian Jesuit priest who'd lived with his band one brutal winter. "They can stare all they want. You're my wife. That's law whether they like it or not." The words were simple, declarative, but they carried the weight of a vow spoken before witnesses. The white preacher, Pastor Hendrick, had been reluctant, his hands actually shaking on the Bible as he'd performed the ceremony, but he'd done it. The marriage wasn't recognized by Tokala's band, yet not until proper gifts were exchanged, and his family formally accepted Annika, but it was real enough in the eyes of the state law of Nebraska that governed Red Oak. Real enough that when the men who ran this town wanted Annika silenced, they had to contend with the fact that she was no longer a vulnerable woman living alone. Real enough that their laughter might soon turn to something else entirely. Red Oak occupied a stretch of Nebraska prairie where fertile wheat land gave way to rolling cattle country, nestled in the crook where Thunder Creek bent south toward the distant Missouri River. Cottonwoods marked the creek's meandering path, like a green ribbon across the tawny landscape, though their leaves were already showing the yellow-brown edges of drought stress. To the west, the land rose into chalk bluffs, riddled with gullies and ravines, carved by centuries of spring runoff. Tucked into one of those rises, boarded up and marked with faded warnings about structural instability, sat the entrance to the old Resurrection Mine, abandoned since the catastrophic cave-in of 1866, that had killed 6 men and buried the silver dreams that had first drawn settlers to this country. The town itself consisted of perhaps 24 substantial buildings arranged along a single main street, with another dozen smaller structures scattered on the side lanes. The north end held the buildings that signified power and permanence. Carlson's Bank, a 2-story affair of milled lumber, with real glass windows imported from Omaha at considerable expense. The sheriff's office with its 3-cell limestone jail. The cattleman's hotel where visiting ranchers stayed when conducting business. And Swenson's Mercantile where settlers bought supplies on credit that never seemed to decrease no matter how many payments they made. The south end, where the land sloped gently toward the creek, housed what the respectable citizens called the immigrant quarter. Though everyone in Red Oak was an immigrant of one sort or another, the term had come to specifically mean those who'd arrived poor and stayed that way. Swedish farmers who'd believed the railroad company's promises of rich soil and cheap land, only to find the reality far harsher. German laborers who'd come west after the war, looking for fresh starts away from the devastation. Dutch craftsmen whose skills weren't valued as highly on the frontier as they'd been in the old country. Irish washerwomen, Polish stonemasons, Norwegian carpenters, all crammed into dugouts, shanties, and sod houses that would flood catastrophically if Thunder Creek ever rose significantly above its banks. Power in Red Oak resided in the hands of 3 men who'd formed an alliance as natural as it was corrupt. Kingsley Carlson owned the bank and chaired the town council. He was a Swede himself. Carlson had been his name in the old country, and he deliberately kept it despite occasional suggestions that he Americanize it to something more palatable. But he'd arrived 20 years ago with money sewn into his coat lining, which made all the difference between immigrant and founding father. Portly and balding at 52, with wire-rimmed spectacles that gave him an air of academic authority, Kingsley presented himself as Red Oak's benevolent patriarch. The man who made loans when Eastern banks wouldn't touch frontier ventures. The man who kept the local economy moving through droughts, grasshopper plagues, and all the other disasters that plagued prairie settlements. His ledgers were always open for inspection, at least the ones he showed to the town council, and his smile was always ready with sympathy for those facing hard times. The fact that those hard times seemed to benefit him more than anyone else was just business acumen, he'd say, with practiced modesty. A man couldn't help it if opportunity came from other people's misfortune. That was simply how markets worked. His primary enforcer was Sheriff Ulysses Hart, though everyone in Red Oak called him Mean Mike after an incident 5 years back, when he'd beaten a suspected horse thief so badly, the man lost an eye and most of his teeth. Hart had come west in the early 1860s as a buffalo hunter, one of the men who'd killed thousands of the great beasts for their hides, until the herds were decimated and there was no profit left in it. He drifted into law work because it paid steady wages and, more importantly, gave him legal sanction to indulge his taste for violence. He wore his tin star with genuine pride and his Colt Navy revolver with the easy confidence of a man who'd killed before. To Indians outlaws, a few men whose deaths had been ruled justifiable in circumstances that wouldn't bear close examination and would certainly kill again without losing sleep over it. Hart's reappointment as sheriff was coming up for a vote this November, which meant he needed to keep the town council happy. And keeping the council happy meant keeping Kingsley happy, since Kingsley controlled 3 of the 5 votes through strategic loans and well-placed pressure. The third leg of this corrupt tripod was Jackson Blackjack Durrett, who owned the Big D Ranch north of town and ran approximately 2,000 head of cattle on what was theoretically open range. Blackjack was a Georgian who'd come west immediately after the war. With money of uncertain origin, some said he'd looted it from burning Atlanta. Others claimed it was payment for services rendered to Union officers who didn't want certain wartime activities examined too closely, and an instinct for acquiring more wealth through means both legal and decidedly otherwise. He employed 30 men, mostly drifters and former Confederate soldiers, who didn't ask uncomfortable questions about brand alterations or whose cattle they were actually herding. And he paid them in scrip redeemable only at his own supply station. This arrangement ensured they were perpetually in debt and perpetually dependent on his goodwill for their survival. Blackjack had been systematically buying up water rights, or what passed for water rights, in a territory where the law was still forming and largely enforced by whoever had the most guns for the past 3 years. He'd also been making generous anonymous contributions to Kingsley's bank and ensuring that Sheriff Hart's election campaigns were well funded with donations from concerned citizens who value law and order. Together, these 3 men formed what the people in the immigrant quarter whispered about as the Syndicate, though never loud enough to be overheard by anyone who might carry tales to the wrong ears. The Syndicate controlled credit law enforcement and the largest economic enterprise in the county. If they wanted something to happen, it happened. If they wanted someone gone, that person found compelling reasons to leave Red Oak before winter, or compelling reasons not to speak up in the first place. Annika Bergstrom had learned about the Syndicate the hard way. She'd been Red Oak's schoolteacher for 18 months, boarding at Miranda O'Rourke's establishment and teaching 23 children their letters in the one-room schoolhouse the town had built with such civic pride back in 1867. She'd been genuinely good at it, patient with the slow learners who struggled with English firm, but fair with the troublemakers who tested boundaries, clever at making lessons stick in young minds that often had more interest in being outdoors than stuck behind desks copying sentences. The children had loved her. Their parents had respected her, at least the immigrant parents had. For the first time since leaving Minnesota, Annika had felt like she was building something meaningful, creating a future that extended beyond mere survival. Then 9-year-old Klaus Müller had come to school with a black eye and a split lip, and everything had changed. Klaus was a quiet German boy, whose father Friedrich farmed 40 marginal acres south of town, coaxing wheat from soil that fought him every season. When Annika had pressed gently, Klaus had finally admitted in halting English that his father had refused to sign over their farm deed as additional collateral for a bank loan extension, and that a foreman from the Big D Ranch, a man named Roscoe, with a scar across his left cheek and dead eyes, had come to their dugout to explain the consequences with his fists. The man had beaten Friedrich in front of his wife and children systematically and methodically, then told them they had 1 week to reconsider before things got significantly worse. Annika had been young enough, naive enough, idealistic enough to still believe in justice. She'd written a careful letter to the state capital Lincoln detailing what she'd learned, not just Klaus's story, but a pattern she'd begun to notice after talking quietly with other families. Kingsley was offering relief loans at 20% monthly interest to farmers whose wells were failing from the drought. The loans required land deeds as collateral. When farmers inevitably couldn't make the crushing payments, the deeds transferred to the bank. And anyone who resisted, anyone who tried to negotiate better terms or questioned the interest calculations, found themselves visited by men from Blackjack's ranch who made the alternatives crystal clear. She'd written it all down with a schoolteacher's attention to detail and documentation. She'd given the sealed letter to Willem van Dyck at the telegraph office, trusting him to send it to the U.S. Marshal for the District of Nebraska's office in Omaha, trusting that the law would intervene once it knew what was happening in Red Oak. The letter had never reached the capital. Instead, 2 days later, a Big D foreman named Roscoe, the same man who'd beaten Klaus's father, had cornered Annika behind the schoolhouse after the children left for the day. He hadn't touched her, not quite, but he'd stood close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and count the tobacco stains on his teeth and see the bone handle of the knife on his belt and understand with perfect, terrible clarity what he was capable of doing. "Teacher lady," he'd said conversationally, as if discussing the weather or the price of wheat. "You seem like a smart woman, real educated. So I reckon you're smart enough to know that some things aren't your concern. Smart enough to know that a woman alone in a place like this, well..." He'd smiled, showing those stained teeth. "Accidents happen. Buildings catch fire. People get hurt walking home in the dark. You understand what I'm saying to you right now?" She'd understood with the kind of clarity that comes from pure animal fear. She'd resigned from her teaching position the very next day, claiming a vague illness that made it difficult for her to continue. No one had protested much. There had already been whispers that she was too familiar with the immigrant families, too willing to teach in German and Swedish alongside English, too soft on discipline for frontier children who needed firm hands. The town council had accepted her resignation with barely concealed relief, and hired a man from Omaha within the week, a dour Methodist who believed fervently in the rod and didn't concern himself with where his students got their bruises. For 2 weeks after that, Annika had stayed in her small rented room at Miranda's boarding house, using her meager savings to pay for room and board while trying to figure out what to do next. Return to Minnesota and admit complete defeat. Try to find another teaching position in another town, knowing that Kingsley's influence reached far and that any references from Red Oak would be poisonous. Stay in Red Oak and find different work, always looking over her shoulder, always wondering when the next threat would come. Every option felt like a different kind of surrender. Then Tokala had come to Red Oak, and everything had changed. He'd been hired as a scout and guide by an army surveyor who was updating territorial map civilian contract work that paid better than reservation rations and let him move between the White and Lakota worlds with relative freedom. The work brought him through Red Oak every few days to file reports at the land office and collect his wages from the Army paymaster. He was Oglala Lakota, from a band that maintained an uneasy, frequently violated peace with the soldiers at Fort McPherson. And he moved between both worlds with the fluid competence of a man who'd learned very early that survival on the frontier meant adaptation pragmatism and the ability to read people and situations with perfect accuracy. They'd met at Thunder Creek one August morning, and their first conversation had changed both their lives. Annika had gone to the creek at dawn to wash clothes work she'd taken on since leaving the schoolhouse because she could do it alone, away from questions and pitying looks and the social complications of being in town. She'd been kneeling on the flat rocks where the water ran shallowest, scrubbing a cotton shirt against the stone, in the way her mother had taught her back in Sweden when she'd suddenly felt eyes on her. She'd looked up to find a Lakota man standing perfectly still upstream beside 2 paint horses that drank from the creek. He wasn't hiding exactly, but he'd been so motionless, so perfectly integrated into the landscape, that she hadn't noticed him until he chose to be noticed. That kind of stillness was deeply unnerving to someone raised in settlements, where people announced their presence with noise and movement and social signals. Her first instinct had been fear, pure and simple. 2 years on the Nebraska frontier had taught her that a woman alone was vulnerable, and that Indians were to be feared. According to every story, the townspeople told stories of raids and kidnappings and atrocities that grew more gruesome with each retelling. But something in the way he stood, in the open, relaxed posture of his body, made her pause. He wasn't threatening. He was just there. "You're early," he'd said in careful English, his voice carrying the slight formality of someone who'd learned the language from multiple sources and deliberately chosen the most precise constructions. "Most people wait until the sun is higher to do washing." "So are you," she'd replied, trying to keep her voice steady, trying not to show that her heart was racing like a rabbit's. "Early, I mean." He'd smiled slightly at that, a subtle expression that softened his angular features. "Water's clearest at dawn, before the cattle downstream stir up the mud and make it cloudy." Before people complicate things, she'd agreed, and something in the way she'd said it, some note of weariness or bitterness that she hadn't meant to reveal, had made him look at her more carefully, with genuine curiosity rather than casual observation. "You're the teacher," he'd said after a moment of assessment. "The one who quit teaching at the school." "I'm not a teacher anymore." "Oh," the words had come out sharper than she'd intended, defensive. "Because you tried to help someone." It wasn't a question. His dark eyes held hers steadily without judgment. "I heard about that incident. Word travels even to the Lakota camps. People talk." "You heard gossip then. Town gossip. It's probably all lies by now." "I heard that a woman did what was right and got punished for it by powerful men who don't like being challenged." He'd secured his horses to a cottonwood with practiced efficiency and walked closer, though he'd stopped at a respectful distance, 10 feet enough that she wouldn't feel physically threatened. "My name is Tokala. It means fox in your language." "Annika Bergstrom." She'd hesitated, then added, "It's Swedish. Bergstrom means mountain stream." "I know." He'd crouched by the water's edge, filling a leather canteen with practiced efficiency. "This creek is dying, Annika Bergstrom. Have you noticed?" "Everyone's noticed. The drought has been terrible this summer." "It's not just drought." He'd stoppered the canteen and looked upstream toward the chalk bluffs that rose in the west. "The Lakota camps downstream from Red Oak are rationing water now. Children are thirsty, horses are suffering. Our scouts found something 3 days ago, a dam built from stone and timber, blocking most of the creek flow in a place we call the Narrows. Someone is deliberately stealing the water." Annika had stopped scrubbing her laundry and looked at him with sharp attention. "A dam, who built it? Whoever owns that land, or whoever wants everyone else to think they own it." Or, his expression had been carefully neutral, but she'd heard the controlled anger underneath. "Whoever wants the town and the camps to blame each other for the water shortage while they profit from both sides' desperation." That's... She'd searched for words. "That's monstrous. That's business, according to some men." He'd stood settling the canteen strap across his shoulder. "There's trouble coming to Red Oak, Annika Bergstrom. The kind of trouble that hurts people who have no defense. People in the Lakota camps who'll be blamed for stealing water they're not taking. People in the shanties south of town who lose everything when debts come due. People who don't have money or guns or friends in positions of power. I can't stop powerful men," she'd said quietly, the defeat heavy in her voice. "I already tried. You see where that got me?" "No." He'd agreed, his tone gentle but pragmatic. "Alone, neither of us can stop them. But you can decide not to be alone when they come after you again. And I can decide the same thing." It had been the strangest proposal Annika had ever heard. Not a proposal of marriage at all, really just a cold statement of tactical reality. But she'd understood what he meant with perfect clarity. A woman alone was vulnerable to threats like Roscoe's vulnerable to being run out of town or worse. A Lakota warrior alone in a white town was vulnerable to false accusations, to violence from men who'd face no consequences, to being used as a scapegoat when powerful people needed someone to blame. But together, they might have protection. He would gain legal standing in the town through marriage to a white woman, a status that made him marginally harder to simply kill or drive away. She would gain a partner who wouldn't be intimidated by veiled threats from ranch foremen who had skills and knowledge that might prove crucial if the water situation deteriorated into open conflict. It was practical, sensible, the kind of arrangement that frontier life sometimes demanded from people who wanted to survive. She'd said yes 3 days later, after thinking it through from every possible angle, and realizing she had no better options and perhaps no better partner for facing what was coming. The wedding had been brief and awkward, conducted by Pastor Hendrick in his cramped parlor with Miranda O'Rourke and Dr. Adele Krause as witnesses. Sheriff Hart had stood in the back of the room throughout the ceremony, arms crossed over his chest, his presence a wordless reminder that this marriage was being monitored, that if it wasn't performed legal and proper, according to territorial statutes, the town would have grounds to challenge it and remove Tocala from Red Oak by force. Kingsley Carlson hadn't attended, but his disapproval had reached them anyway. Through the immediate tightening of credit, through the way merchants suddenly needed cash payment from Annika instead of extending the casual credit they'd offered before, through the cold shoulders and hostile stares that made every trip into town an ordeal. That had been 4 weeks ago. 4 weeks of learning to live together in one rented room above the harness maker's shop. 4 weeks of walking through Red Oak under constant hostile surveillance. 4 weeks of marriage that was legally real but emotionally uncertain. 2 strangers learning to trust each other while the world outside pressed in with judgment and threat, and the slow suffocation of social ostracism. Now on this hot September afternoon, they climbed the narrow wooden stairs to their room, and Annika set down her suitcase with a sigh of relief, flexing cramped fingers. The room was sparse to the point of depressing an iron bedstead with a thin horsehair mattress, a battered trunk that held their few possessions, a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin, and a small table with 2 mismatched chairs. One window looked out over Main Street, and Annika had sewn a simple curtain from flour sacking to give them some semblance of privacy from the eyes of the town. Tocala had been paid his last wages from the Army survey contract 2 weeks ago, the work postponed indefinitely, without explanation. Though they both knew it was because Kingsley had put pressure on the land office to make the Lakota Scouts' presence less welcome. Since then, he'd been hunting jackrabbits and prairie chickens to keep them fed trading game meat for flour and beans with the immigrant families who were less rigidly prejudiced than the town's established citizens. This evening, with the sun painting the western sky in shades of copper and dried blood, Tocala sat at their small table with a damaged canteen, a whetted knife, a bone awl, and several strips of rawhide soaking in a tin cup of water. The canteen's shoulder strap had torn completely away at one attachment point, and he was replacing it using the traditional methods his father had taught him as a boy, boring precise holes with the awl threading wet rawhide through them, pulling the strips tight with his teeth so they would shrink as they dried and hold with impressive strength. Annika sat across from him, holding the canteen steady whenever his work required extra hands or a stable surface. It was a small intimacy, this wordless cooperation, but it had come to mean something over the past weeks. Her fingers would brush his when she passed him a fresh strip of rawhide from the soaking cup. Neither of them pulled away from those brief contacts anymore, not the way they had in the first awkward days of their marriage, when everything had been negotiation and careful boundaries. "Tomorrow, I'll ride upstream," Tocala said quietly, his hands never pausing in their precise, efficient work. "I need to see this dam for myself. Understand what we're actually facing and whether it's as bad as the scouts reported. They'll be watching for you." Annika said, worry tightening her voice despite her attempt to sound calm. If Kingsley built it, and he must have, who else has the resources and the motivation, then he'll have guards posted there. They're always watching me anyway. Might as well give them something worth watching. He smiled without humor, a brief expression that didn't reach his eyes. The real question is what Kingsley's planning. Why build a dam now during drought season? Why hoard water when it will eventually turn the whole territory against him? There has to be an endgame. Annika had been pondering the same question, trying to think like the ruthless men who ran Red Oak, trying to understand their calculations. Unless he wants people to blame someone else for the water shortage. The Lakota camps, most obviously. Build the dam secretly, let Red Oak suffer from thirst, let tensions build, then break the dam and cause a flood that looks like... She stopped the thought too terrible to complete aloud. Takala's hands stilled his dark eyes, meeting hers with grim understanding. Looks like sabotage. Like the Indians attacked the town's water supply out of revenge or territorial aggression. The story practically writes itself. And then Kingsley offers to buy up the destroyed land at disaster prices. Annika continued the scheme, crystallizing in her mind with horrifying clarity. All those families who owe him money, who've signed over their deeds as loan collateral if their homes are destroyed in a sudden flood, if they're desperate and frightened and eager to leave before another Indian attack happens, they'll sell for pennies on the dollar. He forecloses on the rest. Within a year, he'd own half the settlement. And the Lakota take all the blame. Takala said grimly, his jaw tightening with barely controlled anger. Which means retaliation. Calls for the army to round up the camps and force everyone onto the reservation permanently. Maybe even violence against any Lakota found near the town. They'd take away what little freedom we still have to move and hunt and live according to our own ways. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the awl. Clever plan. Evil, but undeniably clever. They sat in heavy silence for a long moment, the enormity of what they were facing settling over them like a suffocating blanket. Then Annika reached across the table and placed her hand over his, deliberately stilling his work. "We'll stop him," she said in Swedish first, "Vi kommer att stoppa honom," and then repeated it in English, wanting him to hear the conviction in both her languages. "We'll find proof that can't be denied or explained away, and we'll stop him. Together." Takala turned his hand palm up beneath hers, his fingers curling around hers in a grip that was warm and surprisingly gentle for hands she'd seen skin rabbits and string bows with casual efficiency. "Together," he echoed. And it sounded less like agreement and more like a sacred vow. Outside their window, the town of Red Oak settled into its evening rhythms. Lamps were being lit in homes up and down the street, casting warm yellow glows into the gathering dusk. Somewhere, a baby cried, with the lusty wails of healthy lungs. Somewhere else, a fiddle played a melancholy Irish tune, the notes carrying clearly, in the still air, the ordinary sounds of ordinary people living ordinary lives, completely unaware that catastrophe was being planned in their names, that powerful men were preparing to sacrifice them for profit. And in the shadows between buildings, Roscoe the Big D foreman leaned against a wall with patient malice and watched their window with the focused attention of a predator studying prey. He'd received his orders earlier that day, directly from Black Jack Durrett himself, keep an eye on the Indian and his woman. They've been asking questions around town. If they start making real trouble, the kind that might interfere with the boss's plans, we handle it permanent like before things get complicated. Roscoe spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust and settled in to watch. He was good at waiting, had patience that came from long experience, and he was even better at violence when the time finally came for it. That time he suspected with something almost like anticipation was coming very soon. 3 miles upstream, where Thunder Creek narrowed and compressed through a rocky defile that locals called the Narrows, was the stone weir stretched across the water, like a medieval fortification transplanted to the American frontier. It was genuinely impressive work. Limestone blocks fitted together with lime mortar, the structure rising a full 4 feet above the current creek bed, braced on the downstream side with heavy timber supports that had been notched into the bedrock and buttressed with carefully placed stones. Behind it, water had pooled into a reservoir, stretching upstream for perhaps a quarter-mile, dark and gleaming and deadly still, holding roughly 400,000 gallons of water that should have been flowing downstream to Red Oak and the Lakota camps beyond. 2 men stood guard there tonight, Big D ranch hands, whose loyalty had been purchased with steady wages and the unspoken promise that the boss would look the other way when they did things that would get them hanged in more civilized places. They had a small fire going against the cooling night, coffee brewing in a battered pot, and well-maintained carbines leaning within easy reach against a boulder. And stacked beside the weir, covered with oilcloth against any chance of moisture, were 4 wooden kegs of black powder with fuses already measured, cut, and coiled, just waiting for the signal. They were waiting for the storm, waiting for the 3rd big tempest of September that was even now building on the western horizon, the one that would dump several inches of rain on the prairie in a matter of hours. When that storm hit and the reservoir filled even higher, when the pressure built to just the right point, they'd light those fuses and ride clear and let nature, helped along by calculated human malice, take its devastating course. The storm was coming. The reckoning was building like pressure behind the dam. And the people of Red Oak, sleeping in their beds and going about their evening routines, had absolutely no idea that their entire world was about to be washed away. Unless someone stopped it. Unless a Swedish schoolteacher and a Lakota scout, married in desperation and learning to trust each other day by uncertain day, could somehow find a way to stand against the corruption that was drowning them all. The paint mare came into town just after sunset, her arrival announced by the desperate clatter of iron-shod hooves on packed earth and the gasping, bellowing sound of an animal at the absolute end of its endurance. She was a distinctive horse with markings that several Red Oak residents recognized immediately. White blaze running down her face, 3 white socks, and a coat pattern of brown and white patches that was unmistakable. Blood matted her left shoulder, where something most likely a bullet had creased the hide without penetrating deeply. Her saddle hung drastically askew, the cinch strap broken, and both stirrups dragging uselessly in the dust and foam covered her neck and chest in a way that spoke of hard miles run in absolute terror. She made it as far as the horse trough outside Brennan's livery before her legs simply buckled. She didn't fall completely, but stood there with her head hanging nearly to the ground, trembling in every muscle, too exhausted to even lower her muzzle to the water that was right in front of her. Annika saw her first. She'd been crossing the street with a basket of mending she was delivering to Miranda's boarding house work she'd taken on for a few desperately needed coins, though Miranda more often paid her in eggs and butter than actual currency when the horse stumbled past. The basket fell from her hands, carefully darned shirts scattering across the dusty street, completely forgotten as she ran toward the suffering animal. She knew this horse. Everyone who'd seen Tokala's cousin Sitan during his occasional visits to Red Oak knew this horse. The distinctive markings were absolutely unmistakable. "Tokala!" She didn't quite shout. A woman shouting in the street drew exactly the wrong kind of attention in a place like Red Oak. But her voice carried enough urgency that heads turned all along Main Street, people emerging from shops and stopping their conversations to see what was happening. Tokala emerged from the harness maker's shop at a dead run, taking in the entire scene in one comprehensive glance. The way a warrior assessed a battlefield, the horse, the blood, the broken tack, the lather that spoke of panic and desperate flight. He moved immediately to the mare's head with careful, deliberate slowness, speaking soft words in Lakota as his hands checked her systematically for injuries with practiced efficiency. "Easy, girl. Easy now. You're safe. Where's Sitan and where's your rider? What happened out there? The horse couldn't answer human questions, but her wild eyes and heaving flanks, and the way she flinched at every sound, told their own clear story. Something had happened. Something bad enough to send her running all the way from the Lakota camps, a good 15 miles, to the dubious safety of Red Oak. A crowd was gathering now, curious townspeople drawn by the spectacle of a blood-streaked Indian pony, appearing riderless in the middle of town at sunset. Sheriff Mean Mike Hart pushed through them with the casual physical aggression of a man who knew his authority was backed by the gun on his hip, and the knowledge that he could use it without facing serious consequences. "That's an Indian pony." He observed his voice carrying that particular mix of statement and veiled accusation that he'd perfected over 5 years as Red Oak's sheriff. Distinctive markings. One of your relatives get thrown. Tokala happens to the best riders sometimes. Satan doesn't get thrown. Tokala's voice was absolutely flat as he continued examining the saddle with meticulous attention to detail. He found what he was looking for. Within seconds, a bullet hole punched through the cantle, the edges of the leather scorched black from close-range muzzle flash. Another hole through the saddlebag on the left side, this one with dried blood crusted around the torn leather. Someone shot at him. Multiple shots from the powder burns and angles. Close range. The horse panicked and ran. Well, now maybe he was someplace he shouldn't have been. Hart suggested with deliberate casualness, his hand resting on his pistol butt in what he probably thought was a subtle gesture of authority. "You people need to understand that there are boundaries in civilized country, places you're not welcome, rules about trespassing on land that white men have claimed and worked." Tokala straightened slowly and very deliberately, his eyes meeting the sheriff's with a directness that most white men in Red Oak would have considered dangerously insolent. The crowd tensed immediately, sensing the potential for violence, people taking small, unconscious steps backward to give the two men room for whatever might happen next. For one long moment, the confrontation hung perfectly balanced, like the instant before lightning strikes. Then, Willem van Dyck burst out of the telegraph office across the street, moving faster than anyone had ever seen the usually sedate and nervous Dutch clerk move. His face was deathly pale beneath his graying beard, and his hands shook so badly that the papers he clutched against his chest rattled audibly. He wore the ink-stained sleeve guards of a man who spent his days copying documents and tapping telegraph keys, and right now, he looked like someone who just looked straight into hell and was desperately trying to warn everyone else before it was too late. "Annika," he called out, his voice cracking with stress and barely controlled panic. "Tokala, I need to speak with you both. Right now, it's desperately urgent." Hart's eyes narrowed with immediate suspicion. "That official business, Van Dyck, because if you've got a telegram for someone, proper procedure is you deliver it through." "Personal message." Willem interrupted with uncharacteristic firmness, though fear was written clearly across every line of his face. "Private business between friends. Nothing that need concern the law." It was transparently a lie, a bad one at that. But Hart chose to let it pass with a grunt of displeasure. The sheriff had bigger concerns at the moment than whatever gossip the nervous telegraph operator might be spreading. He turned back to the crowd with the air of a man establishing the official narrative before wild speculation could take root. "Show's over, folks. Nothing more to see here. Somebody get that horse to Brennan's stable and tend it proper water feed, check that shoulder wound. The Indian can settle the boarding fees later." Tokala wanted to protest that the mare wasn't his personal responsibility to pay for that. Satan would settle all accounts when he was found. But Annika's hand suddenly touched his forearm, the briefest, gentlest pressure. But it communicated volumes. "Don't fight this particular fight right now. Pick your battles carefully. We have much bigger problems." They followed Willem back into the telegraph office, where he immediately pulled down the window shades with shaking hands and lit a kerosene lamp, even though the evening light was still perfectly adequate for seeing. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated, the movements of a man whose nerves were stretched to the absolute breaking point. "I shouldn't be doing this," Willem said, his Dutch accent thickening dramatically with stress, the way it always did when he was agitated. "Mary and Joseph I could hang for intercepting private communications. I could lose my position, my reputation, everything my family depends on. But I heard it come through on the wire, and I couldn't just—" His voice trailed off as he thrust the papers at Annika with trembling hands. "This came in exactly 1 hour and 17 minutes ago. Draft message from Kingsley to Blackjack Durrett. I'm supposed to deliver it to Kingsley's office tomorrow morning after he's had a chance to review it for any corrections, but I made a copy. You need to see this immediately." Annika took the paper, her heart already sinking, even before she read the words written in Willem's careful, precise script. When she did read them, her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Break weir tonight during storm. Flood shanties south of town. Blame Lakota sabotage. Bring land contracts to my office at dawn for immediate signatures. Expect property acquisitions to be complete within 1 week. Confirm receipt of instructions." The words hung in the small lamp-lit office like poison gas, each syllable a potential death sentence for dozens of families. Tokala's expression didn't visibly change, but Annika saw his hands slowly curl into fists at his sides, knuckles whitening with the force of suppressed rage. "Where exactly is this weir located?" "Has to be the Narrows," Willem said, pulling more papers from inside his vest with hands that shook so violently the documents rattled. "It's the only location narrow enough to effectively dam the creek without using an absolutely massive structure. I've never actually seen it myself. I don't ride out that direction. But He spread the additional papers across his desk with the reverent care of a man handling evidence in a murder trial. "I took these documents from the bank vault this afternoon when Kingsley was at the Cattleman's Hotel having lunch. I'm the one who files all of Kingsley's paperwork, you understand. I see every transaction, every contract, every shady deal that goes through that bank. These are payment vouchers for construction crews hired specifically to build upstream water management improvements." That's the exact phrase he used in the ledgers. "Bills of sale for black powder purchased from a mining supply company in Omaha 3 weeks ago, 40 pounds of it, which is enough to demolish a substantial stone structure. And survey maps showing detailed measurements of the Narrows with calculations for optimal dam placement. All of it documented in Kingsley's own handwriting." Annika spread the papers carefully under the lamplight, her teacher's mind automatically cataloging and cross-referencing the information with methodical precision. There were 6 documents in total. 3 showed payments to day laborers for upstream construction work. $30 here, $45 there. All cash transactions that left no detailed paper trail of what was actually being constructed. One was a bill of sale from Schmidt & Sons Mining Supply in Omaha for 40 pounds of black powder and 50 feet of waterproof fuse cord purchased by one Kingsley Carlson and delivered to Red Oak by freight wagon 14 days prior. The final 2 documents were survey maps. The first map showed Thunder Creek's complete course through the Red Oak district, from its origins in the western chalk bluffs all the way to where it joined other tributaries 20 miles to the east. The second map was a remarkably detailed engineering diagram of the Narrows, specifically showing the precise rock formations, measured water depth at various points, calculated flow rate under normal conditions, and estimated changes under drought conditions. Drawn across the narrowest gap in red ink was a thick line with extensive notations written in Swedish Kingsley's native language, apparently used when he wanted to keep his plan's private weir placement here for maximum water retention. Heavy timber bracing required for structural support. Stone blocks to be mortared for permanence. Estimated final reservoir capacity, 400,000 gallons minimum. 400,000 gallons. Tokala said very softly, his mind doing the terrible mathematics with practiced efficiency. Released all at once into a creek bed that's been reduced to barely a trickle by the drought. It would hit the immigrant quarter in less than 10 minutes. Willem finished, his voice breaking with barely suppressed horror. Maybe faster depending on exactly where they breach the dam and how quickly it fails. Those dugouts are all built below street level, carved directly into the hillside for insulation. The shanties and sod houses are constructed on the lowest ground, right next to the creek bed where the land was cheapest. The water would wash them away like they were made of paper and straw. People would drown in their sleep. Children would... He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't speak aloud the images that were clearly torturing him. Why? Annika asked, though a significant part of her analytical mind already understood the horrifying logic. Why would Kingsley orchestrate mass murder? What could possibly be worth that? Land consolidation. Tokala said flatly, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity in his mind. The flood wipes out the poor immigrant families who live in the most vulnerable areas. Kingsley immediately blames it on Indians, claims we sabotaged the creek out of revenge for some imagined slight, maybe says we're angry about treaty violations or land disputes. The town panics. The survivors are desperate to sell their property and leave the area before there are more Indian attacks. And Kingsley is right there with cash offers, buying everything at disaster prices, pennies on the dollar. And all those families who can't sell outright because they've already signed over their property deeds as loan collateral. Annika added, her voice hardening with cold fury as she fully grasped the scheme. Those deeds automatically transfer to the bank if the landowners die intestate, or if they default on their loans, which they certainly will after losing everything in a flood. Either way, whether people sell in panic or die and their land transfers through foreclosure, Kingsley ends up owning everything. Willem nodded miserably, his face gray with guilt and mounting terror. 23 families currently have active mortgages with the bank that use property deeds as primary collateral. I processed every single piece of paperwork myself. Every one of those families lives in the south end of town in the immigrant quarter, directly in the path of any flood coming down Thunder Creek. If that water hits during the night when people are sleeping... He looked at Annika with desperate, pleading eyes. My own family lives there, you understand. My wife, Greta, our 3 children. Jan is only 6 years old. Barely started school. We rent a dugout from the Johansson family because it's all we can afford on my clerk's salary. We'd all be drowned in our beds. My children would die because I was too much a coward to speak up sooner. The magnitude of it settled over them, like a suffocating blanket stealing breath and clarity. This wasn't mere corruption or unethical business practices that hurt people financially. This was premeditated mass murder, carefully disguised to look like natural disaster, with an entire ethnic group deliberately set up to take the blame and suffer violent consequences. We have to stop them. Annika said, her voice remarkably steady given that her hands were shaking. Tonight. Right now. How? Willem's voice was nearly breaking with despair. Hart works directly for Kingsley. Everyone knows he's on the bank's payroll, even if there's no official documentation. Half the men in this town are employed by the Big D Ranch or owe money to Kingsley's bank, with terms that make them effectively indentured. If we try to go to the town council... Kingsley chairs the council. Annika finished bitterly, cutting him off. He controls 3 of the 5 votes through strategic loans and political pressure. The other 2 council members, Gustafson and Henderson, won't move against him without absolutely overwhelming evidence. And even then, they'll probably choose stability over justice. They always do. Then we go directly to the weir. Tokala said with sudden decisiveness, the tactical part of his mind taking over and pushing aside emotion. Tonight, immediately. We document exactly what's been built there, we disable the explosive charges, if we possibly can, and we gather physical evidence that will hold up, even if Kingsley tries to destroy these paper documents. I should come with you. Willem said, though fear was written absolutely clearly across every line of his face, and in the way his hands trembled. No, Tokala said with flat finality. You stay here in town. Keep the original documents hidden somewhere absolutely safe, not in the telegraph office where they could be searched for somewhere unexpected. If Annika and I don't come back by dawn, or if something happens to us, you take everything directly to Fort McPherson. Ride straight to the Army post demand to speak to the commanding officer and make them understand. This isn't just local crime, it's a conspiracy that threatens federal treaty obligations and territorial stability. The Army won't care about a few dozen dead immigrants. Willem said with bitter realism born of long experience with how power actually worked on the frontier. They've looked the other way at worse things. They'll care about an illegal dam constructed on unclaimed federal land without proper surveying or permits. Annika countered with growing confidence as she thought it through. They'll care about black powder being used in ways that directly threaten the fragile peace with Lakota bands that are technically under Army oversight. Frame it as a threat to federal authority and treaty compliance, not as a local dispute. Make them understand that ignoring this could spark exactly the kind of widespread conflict they're supposed to be preventing. She looked at Tokala, meeting his eyes directly. You're absolutely certain about doing this, going out there tonight? Satan was watching them. Tokala said the pieces suddenly falling into terrible place. That's why his horse came back wounded and riderless. He must have discovered what they're planning, probably saw them preparing the powder charges, or overheard them discussing tonight's timeline, and they tried to kill him to silence him before he could warn anyone. His jaw tightened with barely controlled rage, mixed with deep fear for his cousin's safety. He could be lying wounded somewhere out there right now. Dying. Bleeding out slowly in some ravine. We have to go. We have no choice. Annika nodded slowly, already mentally preparing herself for what came next. We'll need horses. Supplies for night riding. I know the route to the Narrows intimately. Tokala interrupted. I've been mapping this entire territory for the Army survey for the past 2 months. I could find that location blindfolded by following the sound of the water alone. And me? Annika asked directly, holding his gaze. Do you need me to come with you, or would I be a liability? He looked at her for a long, assessing moment, and she saw the internal war playing out behind his dark eyes, the protective instinct that wanted to keep her safe and far away from danger, fighting hard against the tactical reality that he needed backup. And perhaps more importantly, needed a white witness whose testimony might actually carry legal weight in ways his never would in this territory. I need you. He said finally, the words carrying more weight than their simple surface meaning. Not just as a witness who can testify in court, as a true partner. Someone I trust absolutely to watch my back and make good decisions under pressure. The words, simple as they were, meant far more than any elaborate declaration could have. Annika felt something fundamental shift in her chest, some barrier she'd been keeping carefully in place since their pragmatic wedding beginning to crack and crumble. Then let's go, she said firmly. Right now before we lose our nerve or they post additional guards. They left through the back door of the telegraph office, moving quickly through the alley shadows, while Willem locked up behind them and headed home to his terrified family, with instructions to pack emergency bags and be ready to flee Red Oak entirely if everything went catastrophically wrong tonight. The sun had fully set now, and stars were beginning to show in a sky that still held the lingering heat of the brutal day. At Brennan's livery Tokala saddled 2 horses with practiced efficiency, while Annika changed into her riding clothes in the small tack-room riding habit, with a divided petticoat designed for straddling a saddle's sturdy boots with good heels and a worn leather jacket against the cold that would come with a prairie night. She checked her small 2-shot Derringer, the one she'd carried constantly since Roscoe's threat, making absolutely sure both chambers held fresh loads. 2 shots. Not much in a serious fight, but infinitely better than nothing. When she emerged from the tack room, Tokala was checking the loads in his Winchester .66 rifle with the methodical care of a man who'd relied on such weapons to keep him alive in dangerous situations. He handed her the Winchester .66 without comment, their fingers brushing as she took it, and she felt the slight calluses on his hands from years of work that her own soft teacher's hands had never known. "You know how to actually use this?" he asked without judgment, just gathering necessary tactical information. "My father taught me to shoot squirrels and rabbits back in Minnesota when I was 12 years old." Annika replied, "I'm not a competitive marksman or anything impressive like that, but I can hit what I'm aiming at if the target is close enough and I have time to line up the shot properly. Close enough is all we'll need if it comes to shooting," Tokala said grimly. He had his own rifle, an older Henry repeater also called the Winchester .66 he'd purchased off a fur trader 2 years ago, and a well-maintained knife in a leather sheath at his belt. Not impressive armament for facing whatever they'd encounter at the Narrows, but more than nothing, and they had surprise on their side. Maybe. They rode out the north end of town, where the buildings thinned to scattered homesteads, and then open prairie the land, rising in gentle swells toward the chalk bluffs that marked the western horizon. Behind them, lamplight glowed warm in Red Oak's windows, ordinary people living ordinary evenings, cooking simple dinners and putting children to bed and talking about the weather and the drought and the price of cattle and all the mundane concerns that filled human lives. Completely unaware that disaster was creeping toward them on deliberately planned and carefully purchased wheels, that powerful men had decided their lives were worth less than profit margins and land acquisition. The horses settled quickly into an easy ground-eating lope that covered distance efficiently. Tokala led them away from Thunder Creek itself, taking a parallel path that used the broken ravine-cut country for cover. The moon was rising now, a waxing gibbous that provided adequate light once their eyes fully adjusted to the darkness. Annika found herself studying Tokala's back as he rode slightly ahead, noting the way he sat his horse with absolutely unconscious grace, the way his head turned constantly in small, precise movements to scan their surroundings for threats or useful information. She realized with some surprise that she trusted this man completely, not just tactically as a competent partner, but deeply and instinctively. This man she'd married barely a month ago out of mutual desperation had become someone she relied on in ways that went far beyond simple survival calculation. Someone whose presence made her feel fundamentally safer rather than simply less alone. The thought was abruptly interrupted by the sharp crack of a rifle shot. Dirt and small stones kicked up perhaps 5 feet to Annika's right, the bullet passing close enough that she actually felt the air displacement as a brief pressure against her arm. The sound of the shot itself came a heartbeat later, rolling across the open prairie like distant thunder. "Ride." Tokala's voice cut through her shock with commanding urgency. "Fast as you can into the trees ahead." She leaned forward instinctively, urging her horse from a lope into a full gallop, adrenaline flooding her system and making her vision almost supernaturally clear and sharp. Behind them, more shots followed, wild and poorly aimed in the darkness, but terrifyingly close enough to be deadly if luck turned against them. She heard bullets whining past, like angry hornets heard one strike a rock somewhere to her left, and ricochet with a distinctive musical ping. Torches bobbed and weaved in the darkness behind them. She counted at least 3 riders, possibly 4, coming hard and fast in pursuit. More shots. One close enough that her horse shied violently to the right, nearly throwing her before she managed to regain control with desperate strength. There. Cut them off at the creek bend. Don't let that damned Indian get away. Boss wants them stopped before they reach the Narrows. The voices carried clearly in the night air, confirming their worst fears. This wasn't random violence or mistaken identity. This was deliberate, organized pursuit with specific orders to prevent them from reaching the dam and discovering whatever was planned for tonight. Tokala angled sharply toward Thunder Creek, where cottonwoods grew thick along the banks and provided cover from the moonlight. Into the trees, stay low. They plunged into shadows so deep it was almost complete darkness, branches whipping viciously at their faces and arms as they crashed through underbrush. Annika heard pursuit crashing through the brush behind them, heard men shouting instructions and curses over the thunder of hooves and the snap of breaking branches. They came this way. I saw them head for the cottonwoods. Can't see a blessed thing in these damn trees. Too dark. Keep looking, boss said this was critical. Said to stop them by any means necessary. The riders circled torches, weaving chaotic patterns through the darkness like angry fireflies. Annika pressed herself against her horse's neck, making herself as small a target as possible, praying that darkness and tree cover would be enough protection. Beside her, though she couldn't actually see him in the absolute blackness beneath the cottonwood canopy, Tokala had gone so perfectly still that he might have been a fallen log or a natural rock formation rather than a living human. One rider came dangerously close, his horse almost stepping directly on Annika's outstretched hand, where she'd pressed it against the ground for balance. She could see the glint of his spurs in the flickering torchlight, could actually count the brass buttons on his vest, big D brand prominently displayed, confirming that these were Black Jack Durrett's men, following Kingsley's orders. She didn't recognize the specific man's face, but she recognized the casual violence in the way he held his rifle. The way his eyes scanned the shadows with the focused intensity of someone actively hoping for an excuse to shoot. Then Tokala moved with explosive suddenness. He uncoiled from perfect stillness like a striking rattlesnake, his braided rawhide lariat swinging in a practiced loop that settled over the rider's shoulders with precision born of years of practice. The rope jerked brutally tight before the man could react, yanking him backward clean out of his saddle. He hit the ground with a grunt that might have been the start of a shout if the impact hadn't driven every bit of air from his lungs. Tokala was on him instantly, knee driving into the small of his back, with calculated force knife blade pressing against his throat, not cutting, not yet just pressing hard enough that the man went absolutely rigid with terror. "Where's Seton?" Tokala demanded, in a voice pitched low and deadly serious. The Lakota rider who was watching the weir. What did you people do to him? The man's eyes were white with pure animal fear in the torchlight that still flickered from where his horse stood nervously nearby. We shot at him 3 days ago. Maybe 4. He was up in the rocks above the Narrows spying on the construction work. We fired warning shots to scare him off and he ran. Horse kept running. We couldn't track him in the dark after that. Is he alive? Don't know. I swear to God, I don't know. We just shot in his general direction to scare him away from the site. Don't even know if we actually hit him or if we just spooked his horse. His horse kept running, and we lost track in the darkness, and a gunshot exploded from somewhere to their left, shockingly loud. Bark sprayed in sharp fragments from the cottonwood directly beside them, splinters stinging Annika's cheek and drawing blood. Another rider had spotted them, was taking aim for a second shot. "Run!" Tokala released his prisoner without further ceremony and grabbed Annika's arm, physically yanking her to her feet. "Go! Don't stop!" They ran together, abandoning the horses, plunging directly into Thunder Creek itself. Cold water shocking against overheated skin, rising from their ankles to their knees to their waists, in the space of a few desperate strides. The current pulled at them, trying to sweep them downstream, surprisingly strong, even though the creek was running far below normal depth. Behind them, men crashed and cursed as they splashed into the water in pursuit, their torches creating wild dancing patterns of light on the water's surface. Annika's riding habit with a divided petticoat dragged at her legs, despite being designed for active movement, the wet fabric suddenly weighing what felt like 20 pounds. She stumbled on the slick rocks of the creek bed, her foot sliding on algae, and would have gone down completely if Tokala's hand hadn't caught her arm with iron strength, steadying her, pulling her inexorably forward. "Keep going. Don't stop moving no matter what." They reached the far bank and scrambled up desperately, using exposed roots and protruding rocks for handholds, their fingers slipping on wet bark and stone. Annika's lungs burned with the effort, her hands were scraped raw and bleeding, her muscles screaming from exertion and fear. But they were alive, they were moving toward the Narrows, and stopping now would mean capture or death. A rider burst from the trees behind them with a tremendous splash, his horse plunging through the creek in a geyser of spray. The man raised his pistol with practiced ease, taking careful aim at Tokala's back, at the man who was her husband. And time seemed to slow to crystalline clarity as Annika watched it happen. Her hand found the Winchester .66 at her shoulder, purely on instinct brought it up, and fired in one fluid motion, barely aiming, just pointing the barrel toward the threat and pulling the trigger on pure, desperate reflex. The shot went wide, her hands were shaking from exertion and cold water, her aim thrown completely off by exhaustion and fear. But it was close enough to matter. The bullet passed near enough to the rider's head that he heard that distinctive supersonic crack, and his horse reared in pure panic. The man fought desperately for control, lost it completely, and tumbled backward into the creek with a tremendous splash that sent water gazering up into the moonlight. By the time he surfaced a few seconds later, sputtering and cursing, and minus his pistol which had been lost in the water, Annika and Tokala had vanished completely into the darkness ahead, swallowed by the broken country and the night. They ran for another 10 minutes at varying speeds, sometimes at a full sprint, where the ground was open, sometimes at a careful walk, where ravines and rocks made speed dangerous, before Tokala finally slowed to a stop in the shelter of a deep ravine. Both of them were gasping for air, soaked completely to the skin, shaking with a combination of adrenaline crash and cold and delayed shock. "You shot at him," Tokala said, and there was something very close to wonder in his voice despite the circumstances. "I missed completely," Annika replied, disgusted with her own lack of skill. "I'm a terrible shot under pressure, apparently. But you tried. You fired your weapon to protect me without hesitation." He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read in the darkness. "You could have run. Left me to draw their fire while you escaped. That would have been the logical thing to do." She met his eyes directly. "Of course I didn't run. We're in this together, remember? That was the entire point of getting married in the first place. Neither of us faces these threats alone anymore." Tokala's hand found hers in the darkness, their fingers lacing together and squeezing tight with a pressure that communicated far more than words. "Together," he echoed softly, "to whatever end we reach." They had no way of knowing how soon that end might come, or how much they'd have to sacrifice to reach it alive. They only knew that somewhere ahead in the darkness, a dam held back 400,000 gallons of water, and 4 kegs of black powder weighted with cut fuses, and somewhere behind them, armed men were hunting them to prevent the truth from coming out into the light. But they were together. And somehow, improbably, that single fact made the impossible seem almost manageable, made it feel like they had a genuine chance rather than none. They moved forward into the night, toward the Narrows, toward whatever waited there in the darkness. Two people against corruption and institutional power, and a plot that could kill dozens of innocent people. By any logical calculation, it should have felt completely hopeless. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something that might actually change their world.